She's still unemployed. The words hung in the air like a slap across my face. My mother's voice carried across the reunion, making sure everyone heard how she saw me. I stood there in my dress uniform, the same uniform I'd worn to Pentagon briefings, listening to my family laugh at the joke about their failure of a daughter. They had no idea a helicopter was already on its way. They had no idea who I really was. This is where everything changed. I'm Catherine Mitchell, and I've spent 23 years serving my country in the United States Navy. But to my parents, I was just the daughter who never quite measured up, the one they told everyone was still trying to find herself. For years I sent money home, covered their bills when times got rough, rearranged my leave schedule around their needs. Yet somehow, at every family gathering, I became the punchline to their jokes about disappointment. Growing up in our small Virginia town, success had a very specific definition in my parents' minds. My brother Thomas worked at a local bank, had a mortgage, drove a new truck every 3 years. My sister Emily taught 3rd grade at the elementary school we'd all attended. Married her high school sweetheart, had 2 beautiful children. These were accomplishments my parents could explain at church, could brag about at the grocery store, could measure against the neighbors' children. But me? I was different from the start. While Thomas played football and Emily sang solos in the church choir, I spent my time reading books about far-off places, studying maps of oceans I'd never seen, dreaming of something bigger than our town could offer. I'd spread National Geographic magazines across my bedroom floor, tracing shipping routes with my finger, memorizing the names of ports in countries I could barely pronounce. My 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, once told my parents I had an exceptional mind for strategy and spatial reasoning. She suggested advanced programs, maybe even military academies when I got older. My parents smiled politely and never mentioned it again. They didn't want a daughter who exceeded expectations. They wanted one who fit neatly into them. I remember the day I first saw a Navy recruiter at our high school career fair. While my classmates flocked to the college booths, I stood transfixed by the photos of ships cutting through ocean waves, of officers standing on bridges overlooking endless blue horizons. The recruiter, a chief petty officer named Martinez, noticed my interest and spent an hour talking to me about opportunities I'd never imagined existed. When I brought home the recruitment materials, my mother found them in my backpack and threw them in the trash. "The military is no place for young ladies," she said. "You'll find a nice job here in town, maybe at the bank like Thomas." But I retrieved those pamphlets from the garbage that night, smoothed them out and hid them under my mattress like contraband. My parents saw this as rejection of their values rather than expansion of my horizons. When I told them I was joining the Navy at 18, my mother cried. Not tears of pride or even fear for my safety, but tears of embarrassment. "What will people think?" she asked, as if serving my country was something shameful. My father just shook his head and predicted I'd be back within 6 months, ready to pursue a real career like my siblings. But I didn't come back. I thrived in the structure and purpose of military life. Boot camp at Great Lakes was brutal, but I found strength I didn't know I had. While other recruits cried themselves to sleep, homesick for familiar comforts, I felt like I was finally becoming who I was meant to be. The physical challenges pushed my body to its limits. But the mental discipline, the strategic thinking, the leadership training, these fed something hungry in my soul. My first posting was to a destroyer based out of Norfolk. I was one of only 3 women in my division, and the only one from a small town with no military family tradition. The other sailors came from Navy families, understood the culture, knew the unspoken rules. I had to learn everything through observation and occasionally painful mistakes. There was a moment, 6 months into my first deployment, when everything clicked. We were running navigation drills in rough seas, and the senior officers were testing our ability to maintain course despite equipment failures. While others panicked, I found myself calmly working through alternative solutions, using celestial navigation techniques I'd studied on my own time. The operations officer watched me work and said quietly, "You have the instincts for this, Mitchell." That's not something that can be taught. Those words mattered more than any praise I'd ever received from family. They were based on observation of actual competence, not on meeting someone else's predetermined expectations. From that moment, I knew I'd found my calling. While my high school classmates were navigating college parties and entry-level jobs, I was learning to navigate actual ships, studying tactical operations, earning commendations for my dedication and skill. My first evaluation described me as exceptionally promising with natural leadership abilities and strategic thinking that exceeded her rank. Each promotion felt like validation that I'd chosen the right path, even if my family couldn't see it. The financial struggles started during my 10th year of service. I was a lieutenant by then, stationed at Pearl Harbor when I got the call from my mother. It wasn't a request so much as a statement of fact. "Your father's been cut to part-time," she said. "The mortgage is due next week." The way she said it, there was no question about what she expected me to do. I remember sitting in my small base apartment, calculating how much I could send without depleting my emergency fund. $700. It would cover their mortgage and leave them something for groceries. I transferred it that night, no questions asked, because that's what family does. Or so I thought. The next month, it was Thomas who needed help. His wedding was coming up and the reception venue wanted a deposit he couldn't cover. "Could you help your brother out?" my mother asked. Family supports family. So I sent another 1,000, telling myself it was an investment in family harmony. Then Emily needed help with student loans during her maternity leave. Then my father's truck broke down. Then the roof leaked. Each time the request came wrapped in assumptions about my duty as the childless daughter with no real responsibilities. After all, as my mother often said, it's not like you have a family of your own to support. By my 15th year of service, I was sending home nearly a third of my salary. I lived in base housing, drove a 10-year-old Honda, wore uniforms instead of civilian clothes, all to maintain the financial pipeline that kept my family afloat. Meanwhile, Thomas bought a boat. Emily renovated her kitchen. My parents took a cruise to celebrate their anniversary. I paid for Thomas's wedding reception when his savings fell short. I covered Emily's student loans when she took maternity leave. I kept my parents' mortgage current when my father had surgery. But during family phone calls, my contributions disappeared from the narrative. My mother would spend 20 minutes telling me about Thomas's latest promotion or Emily's daughter's dance recital, then ask about my little boat job as if I was playing sailor while my real life waited on hold. When I mentioned my promotion to lieutenant commander, she responded with, "That's nice, dear. Did I tell you Thomas is thinking about buying a vacation home?" The pattern was clear but painful. Every achievement I earned was minimized or ignored. Every sacrifice I made was expected rather than appreciated. When I couldn't attend Emily's baby shower because I was deployed to the Persian Gulf, I was the absent sister who didn't prioritize family. When I missed 3 Christmases in a row due to military obligations, I was the daughter who'd abandoned her roots. My parents developed a story about me that they shared with anyone who would listen. "Catherine is still finding herself," they'd say with practiced concern. "She's been drifting for years, can't seem to settle down. We worry about her constantly." This fiction was easier for them to maintain than admitting their daughter had succeeded in ways they couldn't understand or explain to their social circle. The extended family absorbed this narrative without question. At every gathering, relatives would pull me aside with gentle suggestions about career changes, about settling down, about what really matters in life. They meant well, but their concern was based on lies my parents had carefully cultivated over the years. Meanwhile, my actual life was expanding in ways they couldn't imagine. I was leading operations that affected national security, making decisions that impacted hundreds of personnel, earning respect from admirals and generals who valued competence over conformity. But none of this translated to the small-town currency of success my family recognized. The breaking point came at my grandmother's 80th birthday reunion. I'd specifically requested leave for this event, wanting to celebrate the one family member who'd always supported my choices without reservation. My grandmother had served as a nurse during World War II and understood service in ways my parents never would. I arrived at Uncle Robert's farm that Saturday morning, wearing my dress uniform because my grandmother had requested it. She wanted to see me in all my brass and ribbons, she'd said on the phone. The gathering was already in full swing when I arrived. Relatives clustered in familiar groups, children running across the lawn. The smell of barbecue filling the air. At first, everything felt normal, even pleasant. I caught up with cousins I hadn't seen in years, helped set up tables, listened to family stories I'd heard dozens of times but still enjoyed. For a few hours, I could pretend that my family saw me as I really was rather than the fiction they'd created. Then came the moment that changed everything. We were all gathered on the lawn, plates balanced on our laps, when Aunt Linda asked about updates from the younger generation. Thomas stood up and announced his promotion to regional manager, earning applause and congratulations. Emily shared news about her daughter's acceptance to a gifted program, drawing admiring comments from the relatives. When attention turned to me, I saw my parents exchange a look I knew too well. Before I could speak for myself, my mother's voice cut through the gathering. "Oh, Catherine's still unemployed," she said with a laugh that invited others to join in. Still floating around, trying to figure out what to do with herself. The words hit me like ice water. I was sitting there in my naval uniform, with commendation ribbons visible to anyone who looked, and she was calling me unemployed. The absurdity of it was matched only by the cruelty. My father added his own contribution. "Maybe she can help with the dishes for once," he said, grinning at the crowd. Lord knows she never did them growing up. The lie was so blatant it took my breath away. I'd been responsible for kitchen cleanup every night through high school while my siblings studied or watched television. The laughter that followed was genuine and widespread. Relatives who should have known better, who could see my uniform, who knew I'd been in the Navy for over 2 decades, laughed at the image of me as the family failure. They laughed because my parents had spent years preparing them for this moment, conditioning them to see me as a disappointment regardless of evidence to the contrary. I sat frozen, my face burning with humiliation and rage. 23 years of service, multiple combat deployments, commendations for exceptional performance, and leadership of entire naval operations had been reduced to a punchline about unemployment and dishwashing. The people who should have been my strongest supporters had just publicly destroyed my reputation for their own amusement. My grandmother looked confused and troubled, but in the chaos of laughter and commentary, her voice was lost. The cousins who'd been friendly minutes before now looked at me with the kind of sympathy reserved for someone struggling with basic adulting. The shift was immediate and complete. I excused myself and walked to the farmhouse, needing space to breathe and think. In the kitchen, I gripped the counter and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't casual thoughtlessness or misunderstanding. This was deliberate, calculated humiliation designed to put me in my place and reinforce my parents' narrative about their disappointing daughter. My cousin David found me there a few minutes later. He was one of the few family members who'd ever questioned the stories about my supposed failures. "That was wrong," he said simply. "Everyone knows you're in the Navy. Everyone knows you helped them financially. Why would they say those things?" "Because it's easier than admitting they don't understand my life," I told him. "Because having a daughter who succeeded outside their framework threatens everything they believe about how the world works." David told me he'd noticed the pattern over the years. How my parents would deflect questions about my career, minimize my achievements, redirect attention to my siblings whenever my name came up. He'd assumed they were being modest on my behalf. Now he realized they'd been systematically erasing me from the family's success stories. Standing in that kitchen, I made a decision. I was done trying to earn recognition from people who were invested in my failure. I was done sending money to parents who repaid my support with public mockery. I was done pretending that their version of love, which required me to be smaller than I was acceptable. That's when we heard it. The sound started as a distant thrum, then grew into the unmistakable rhythm of helicopter rotors. Not the casual flyover of civilian aircraft, but the purposeful approach of military aviation. Through the window, I watched relatives stop mid-conversation and look toward the sky. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, dark green with Navy markings, approaching with the direct intention that meant official business. This wasn't a training exercise or a courtesy flight. This was operational priority, the kind that only happened when someone's expertise was urgently needed. The aircraft circled once before beginning its descent onto the largest clear area of Uncle Robert's lawn. The rotor wash sent napkins flying and forced people to grab their plates and glasses. Children pressed against their parents, wide-eyed at this unexpected interruption to their afternoon. I walked out of the farmhouse toward the landing zone, my training taking over. When a military helicopter tracks you down during personal leave, it means something significant has happened. The gathered relatives parted as I passed, their earlier laughter replaced by confusion and growing concern. As the rotors slowed, the passenger door opened and Captain Reynolds stepped out. I knew her from strategic operations at the Pentagon, a no-nonsense officer who didn't make social calls. She approached me with crisp military bearing, her expression serious and professional. "Admiral Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent gathering. I apologize for interrupting your family event, but we have an urgent situation requiring your immediate expertise. There's been a development in the Pacific that needs your personal attention. The word Admiral rippled through the crowd like an electric shock. I saw my mother's hand go to her throat, my father's mouth fall open. Relatives who'd been laughing about my unemployment 30 minutes earlier stared at me as if I'd shapeshifted into someone entirely different. Captain Reynolds continued, professional and urgent. We have transportation standing by to take you directly to Andrews, then priority transport to Pearl Harbor. The Joint Chiefs need your assessment within 12 hours. The Joint Chiefs. The words hung in the air, impossible to misunderstand or minimize. The unemployed daughter who couldn't figure out her life was being summoned by the highest levels of military command for her expertise on a crisis in the Pacific. I understand, Captain, I replied, my voice carrying the authority that came from years of command decisions. Give me 3 minutes to collect my belongings. As I walked back toward the farmhouse, I could feel the weight of everyone's stares. My parents stood frozen, their earlier confidence evaporated, replaced by something that might have been shame or might have been shock at how wrong they'd been about their own daughter. "Catherine," my mother called out, her voice cracking. We didn't. We never knew. There was no time for explanations or confrontations. The helicopter was waiting. The situation in the Pacific was developing. And my real life, the one where my contributions mattered and my expertise was valued, needed me. The family that had mocked me for their entertainment would have to process this revelation on their own. I grabbed my overnight bag, said a quick goodbye to my grandmother with a promise to call her soon, and walked back to the helicopter with Captain Reynolds. As I climbed aboard, I took one last look at the reunion. They stood in a loose semicircle, these people who thought they knew my story, watching as the disappointment they'd laughed about was airlifted to handle matters of national importance. The helicopter lifted off, and I watched Uncle Robert's farm shrink below us. The reunion would continue, but it would be different now. The comfortable narrative my parents had created about their failed daughter had been shattered by reality arriving in the form of military aviation and urgent summons from the Pentagon. As we flew toward Andrews Air Force Base, Captain Reynolds briefed me on the situation, a complex maritime territorial dispute that threatened to escalate into something larger. My mind shifted fully into professional mode, analyzing options, considering implications, preparing for the decisions that would need to be made. But part of me remained aware of what had just happened at that reunion. The family that had dismissed me as unemployed had just witnessed the truth, that their mockery had been directed at someone whose judgment was trusted with decisions affecting national security. The daughter they'd diminished to make themselves feel superior was actually operating at levels of responsibility they couldn't even comprehend. According to David, who called me weeks later, the aftermath of my departure dominated the rest of the reunion. My parents faced a barrage of questions they couldn't answer. How long had I been an admiral? What exactly did I do for the Navy? Why had they been telling everyone I was unemployed? Their attempts at explanation only made things worse. They claimed they'd been concerned about my personal life, but relatives pointed out that being single wasn't the same as being unemployed. They suggested they'd been making jokes, but nobody could understand why my career would be a source of humor rather than pride. The extended family began piecing together the truth from fragments they'd observed over the years. The money I'd sent home during financial crises, the missed holidays due to deployments, the times I'd shown up in uniform only to have my parents change the subject when asked about my service. The pattern became clear. My parents had been deliberately minimizing my achievements while taking my financial support. Uncle Robert was particularly vocal in his disgust. "That woman has been serving our country for over 2 decades, he said, and you've been telling us she's a failure? While she's been paying your bills and keeping you afloat? The shame of it." My siblings had their own reckonings to face. Thomas realized that his position as the successful son had been built partly on the foundation of my supposed failure. Emily understood that her role as the good daughter had been enhanced by contrast with my fabricated disappointments. Neither had actively participated in the mockery, but neither had questioned it either. The relationship with my parents changed fundamentally after that day. The first few attempts at contact were awkward, filled with their attempts to explain or minimize what had happened. But I wasn't interested in explanations that avoided accountability. They had chosen to humiliate me publicly after years of private diminishment. That wasn't something that could be explained away as misunderstanding. Eventually, after months of distance and several honest conversations, we reached a new equilibrium. They began learning about my actual career, asking questions about my work, showing genuine interest in understanding what they'd dismissed for so long. The financial support stopped, of course. They learned to manage their own finances without the daughter they'd called unemployed. The extended family's attitude shifted dramatically. Some relatives reached out with genuine apologies for their participation in the mockery. Others maintained embarrassed distance, perhaps uncomfortable with reminders of their own rush to judgment. The story of the reunion became family legend, told differently depending on who was narrating. But for me, the reunion marked a turning point in how I understood family, respect, and the price of seeking approval from people invested in your failure. The helicopter that landed on Uncle Robert's lawn didn't just take me to handle a military crisis. It carried me away from a toxic dynamic I'd tolerated for far too long. My career continued to advance in ways that would have seemed impossible during those early years of family doubt. The Pacific situation I was called to handle turned out to be a complex territorial dispute involving 3 nations, hundreds of vessels, and the potential for significant escalation. For 2 weeks, I worked 18-hour days, coordinating with international partners, managing intelligence flows, and developing strategic options that would protect American interests while preventing unnecessary conflict. When the situation finally resolved through diplomatic channels backed by carefully positioned naval assets, the Joint Chiefs commended not just the outcome, but the approach. Your ability to see beyond immediate tactical advantages to long-term strategic stability is exactly why we needed you, the Chief of Naval Operations told me. This kind of thinking, this level of strategic sophistication, it's rare. Each achievement felt more meaningful because I no longer carried the weight of family dismissal. I could fully embrace my successes without the shadow of their doubt diminishing them. My work had immediate, tangible impact on national security, on the lives of thousands of service members, on the stability of entire regions. This was real success, not the kind that needed to be explained or justified at family dinners. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my parents had been telling everyone I was unemployed and directionless, I'd been making decisions that affected international security. While they'd been joking about me washing dishes, I'd been leading operations involving thousands of personnel and millions in resources. The disconnect between their fiction and my reality had finally become too large to sustain. 2 years later, I received my second star and an assignment to lead a joint task force on emerging naval technologies. The ceremony was held at the Pentagon with full honors. I sent my parents an invitation not out of obligation, but as a final opportunity for them to see who their daughter had actually become. They attended, sitting in the audience among other military families who understood the significance of the rank and responsibility being conferred. For the first time in my memory, I saw genuine pride in their faces. Not the manufactured pride they performed for social occasions, but real recognition of what I'd achieved despite their lack of support. After the ceremony, my mother approached me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "We were so wrong about everything. We were so busy trying to make you fit our small idea of success that we couldn't see how big your actual success was." It was the apology I'd needed but never expected to receive. Not because it erased the years of dismissal and mockery, but because it acknowledged the harm they'd caused and their responsibility for it. We would never have the close relationship that might have developed with support and respect from the beginning, but we could have something honest, which was more than we'd had before. My grandmother lived to see me receive that second star. At 92, she attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, wearing her best dress and her own World War II service pins. She'd been a surgical nurse in the Pacific Theater, had seen things that she never talked about, but that lived in her eyes when she looked at old photographs. She was the one family member who truly understood service. When I was young, she'd pull me aside during family gatherings and tell me stories, not about the war itself, but about the women she'd served with. Strong women, she'd say. Women who did what needed doing without asking for permission or praise. During one visit home when I was a lieutenant commander, she'd taken my hand and said, "Your parents don't understand what you do because they've never had to be bigger than themselves. They've never had something matter more than their own comfort. But you do. You understand what I understood all those years ago. that some things are worth sacrificing for. She'd kept every newspaper clipping that mentioned my name, every photo I'd sent from various ports around the world. While my parents were telling people I was unemployed, she was creating a scrapbook titled My Granddaughter, the Admiral, even before I'd reached that rank. She believed in my future when others couldn't see my present. When I knelt beside her chair after the second star ceremony, she gripped my hand with surprising strength. "I lived long enough to see this," she whispered. "I lived long enough to see you become everything I knew you could be. Your parents are finally seeing it too. But I want you to know I saw it from the beginning." 6 months later, at her funeral, the church was packed. She'd touched many lives in her 93 years. When it came time for the eulogy, I stood at the podium in my dress whites, looking out at a sea of faces that included my parents, my siblings, and the extended family who had witnessed that dramatic reunion 3 years earlier. I talked about service, about sacrifice, about the courage to see people as they truly are rather than as we wish them to be. I told the story of a young nurse who had left her small town to serve in places where comfort was a luxury and duty was everything. I drew the parallels to my own journey, making it clear that she had been my inspiration, my true north when family support had been absent. My parents sat in the front row, finally understanding that the daughter they'd dismissed had become someone worthy of delivering final words for the family matriarch. The helicopter landing at the reunion became more than just a dramatic moment of vindication. It became the catalyst for truth in a family system built on comfortable lies. It forced everyone to confront the gap between their assumptions and reality, between their narratives and facts. But most importantly, it freed me from the exhausting work of trying to earn recognition from people who were invested in withholding it. The daughter who had stood silent while being mocked was gone, replaced by someone who understood that respect isn't a gift others give you, but a standard you maintain regardless of others' opinions. The reunion story still gets told at family gatherings, though I rarely attend them anymore. My life is full with meaningful work, genuine relationships, and the kind of respect that comes from actual achievement rather than social positioning. The family that once defined my worth through their limitations now has to reckon with their own choices in how they treated someone who only ever tried to serve with honor. The helicopter that landed that day didn't just interrupt a family reunion. It delivered a message that some truths are too big to hide, some achievements too significant to minimize, and some people too valuable to diminish, even if it takes dramatic intervention for everyone to finally see it. Looking back now from the perspective of a career that exceeded even my own early dreams, I can see that the reunion was never really about me. It was about my parents' need to control the narrative of their children's lives, to maintain their position as authorities on success and failure. My achievements threatened that control, so they worked to suppress them. The colleagues who became my real family understood this in ways my biological family never could. Captain Sarah Chen, who served as my executive officer during a particularly challenging deployment, once told me, "You know what makes you exceptional, Admiral? It's not your strategic mind, though that's impressive. It's that you never let anyone make you smaller than you are. You expanded despite the pressure to contract." Commander James Rodriguez, who worked with me on numerous operations, had met my parents once at a military event. Afterward, he pulled me aside and said, "Now I understand why you work twice as hard as everyone else. You're not just proving yourself to the Navy. You're proving something to ghosts who aren't even watching." He was right. For years, I'd been trying to earn recognition from people who were actively working against giving it. Every commendation, every promotion, every successful operation was partially fueled by the need to prove wrong the narrative my family had created about me. But after the reunion, that need disappeared. My work became purely about the mission, about serving something greater than personal validation. The freedom that came from no longer seeking my family's approval was transformative. I could make decisions based solely on strategic merit, lead without the shadow of doubt that had always whispered maybe they're right about you. The younger officers I mentored often asked about work-life balance, about managing family expectations with military demands. I would tell them the truth, that sometimes the family you're born into isn't capable of understanding the person you're meant to become. And that's not your failure or theirs. It's simply a mismatch between their capacity to see and your capacity to grow. One young lieutenant, whose parents had similarly dismissed her military service as a phase, broke down in my office after a particularly difficult family visit. "They keep asking when I'm going to get a real job," she said through tears. "They think because I don't have a husband and kids, I'm wasting my life." I told her what I wished someone had told me 20 years earlier. Your worth isn't determined by their understanding. Your service has value whether they see it or not. The lives you protect, the missions you complete, the integrity you maintain, these matter regardless of whether your family can comprehend their significance. She went on to become one of the finest tactical officers I ever served with, partially because she learned early what had taken me decades to understand. That external validation from those incapable of providing it is a fool's errand. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it arrives in the form of military aircraft and urgent summons from the Pentagon. The unemployed daughter they mocked turned out to be someone whose expertise was considered essential to national security. The family disappointment they'd created in their stories was actually someone who had exceeded every measure of professional success. The lasting lesson isn't about vindication or revenge. It's about the importance of defining yourself by your own standards rather than accepting others' limitations as your truth. It's about understanding that family love that requires you to be smaller than you are isn't love at all. It's about recognizing that respect isn't negotiable in healthy relationships, whether they're personal or professional. The helicopter landed, I answered the call, and I never looked back at the small definitions of success that had once seemed so important to overcome. My life had grown too large for their framework, and that was their loss, not mine.